Space is not a peaceful, silent ocean. It is an absolute, unforgiving void that is constantly trying to kill you. When your engines die and your thermal regulators freeze in the pitch black of the Cygnus expanse, you don't pray for a miracle. You calculate how many hours of breathable oxygen you have left before the CO2 scrubbers choke out. In the wider galactic concordant, rescue is a matter of bureaucracy, a cold calculus of risk versus reward. But there is one species in the galaxy that never learned how to do that math. A species whose very history is etched in blood defiance and a terrifying, irrational pack-bonding instinct. This is the story of a doomed crew, adrift in the deep dark, and the day they learned why you should always broadcast on human frequencies. The Celestia, a deep space survey frigate belonging to the Orionist Coalition, was dying. It wasn't a sudden violent death, but a slow, agonizing asphyxiation. The ship groaned in the absolute zero of the outer rim, its titanium composite hull contracting and popping in the vacuum. 3 days ago, a localized gravimetric anomaly, a tear in the fabric of space that the navigational computers hadn't predicted, had shattered their main drive coil. The resulting feedback loop had fried the primary reactor, severed the auxiliary power lines, and violently ejected their emergency beacon into the void. Captain Alfred Pendleton, a name given to him by the ship's human design translation matrix, matching his native cultural designation to standard Earth linguistics, floated in the center of the bridge. The artificial gravity had failed 48 hours ago. "Status on the life support Aris," Alfred asked, his breath misting in the freezing air of the command deck. Aris, the ship's chief engineer, was tethered to a diagnostic panel, his gloved hands moving sluggishly over the frozen interface. Like Alfred, he was an avian-descended humanoid, though the freezing temperatures were making his normally vibrant features pale and sunken. "We are running on the tertiary battery reserves," Captain Aris replied, his voice a mechanical rasp through the localized comms of their hazard suits. "I've bypassed the port-side thermal regulators to keep the bridge at a habitable -10 degrees Celsius. But the oxygen scrubbers are clogging. At our current consumption rate, we have 14 hours of breathable air. After that, the toxicity levels will become lethal. 14 hours. Alfred closed his eyes. They were a crew of 42 scientists, researchers, and engineers. They were unarmed, unarmored, and entirely alone in a sector of space designated as the Dead Zone, a stretch of the galaxy so devoid of resources and habitable planets that even the most desperate pirate cartels avoided it. "What about the distress signal?" Alfred pressed, pushing off a bulkhead to float closer to the communications terminal. Lieutenant Caldwell, the communications officer, looked up. Her face was illuminated by the single flickering amber glow of the emergency console. "I've been broadcasting the concordant SOS protocol on a continuous loop for 3 days, sir. The signal is weak. Without the main antenna array, we are only pushing about 4,000 kilowatts. It's a whisper in a hurricane. Even if a concordant patrol ship is in the adjacent sector, their bureaucratic protocols require a Class 3 authorization to enter the dead zone. By the time their risk assessment committee approves a rescue mission, we'll be frozen corpses." It was a harsh, bitter truth. The Galactic Concordant was an alliance built on pure, unadulterated logic. Everything was calculated. If the cost of the fuel, the hazard pay for the crew, and the statistical probability of a successful recovery did not outweigh the loss of 42 scientists and a mid-tier frigate, the Concordant would simply write them off as an acceptable statistical anomaly. It was a cold universe, mirrored perfectly by the institutions that governed it. "There has to be someone," Alfred whispered, slamming a gloved fist against the titanium bulkhead. Widen the frequency, drop the encryption, broadcast on every open channel, unregulated subspace bands, even the archaic radio frequencies. I don't care if it takes 100 years to reach a listening post, someone needs to know we died here. Caldwell's fingers danced over the sluggish keys. Widening parameters. I am loading a repeating macro, distress code Alpha 9, translating into standard Galactic and... Wait. She paused, her brow furrowing. Captain, I can piggyback the signal onto the old slipspace telemetry bands. It's highly unstable, incredibly noisy, and it's mostly used by independent mining conglomerates and human military vessels. Aris scoffed from across the room. Humans. They are chaotic, unpredictable primitives. They've only been in the interstellar community for 3 centuries. Their ships are flying hazards held together by duct tape and kinetic force. At this point, Aris, I would gladly board a human garbage scow if it had a working heater, Alfred snapped. Do it, Caldwell. Broadcast on the human frequencies. Use their legacy hailing channels. Caldwell nodded. Setting transmission. To any vessel in range. This is the Concordant Survey ship Celestia. We have suffered catastrophic reactor failure. Life support failing. Crew of 42 aboard. We require immediate assistance. Broadcasting now. The silent ping echoed out into the uncaring cosmos, traveling at the speed of light through the dark. On the bridge, the crew settled into the agonizing quiet, the creeping frost inching up the viewing ports, obscuring the distant mocking light of the stars. Alfred watched his crew huddle together, tethering themselves to the central command table to share body heat. They were going to die here. Alfred felt the heavy, crushing weight of failure press down on his chest. He was their captain. He had promised them discovery science and a safe return. Now all he could offer them was a slow fade into the endless black. By the 12th hour, the silence aboard the Celestia had become absolute. The low hum of the tertiary batteries had finally died, leaving the ship with only emergency chemical lighting that cast long, sickly green shadows across the frost-covered walls. The temperature had plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The hazard suits were failing, their internal heating meshes drained of power. Alfred lay strapped into his command chair, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The carbon dioxide alarms had stopped blaring an hour ago, mercifully dead due to lack of power, but the effects were undeniable. A heavy narcotic lethargy was settling over the bridge. Aris was unconscious, floating limply by the engineering console. Caldwell was barely keeping her eyes open, her vitals monitored by a blinking red light on her chest plate that pulsed with agonizing slowness. Alfred's mind began to wander, drifting back to the homeworld he would never see again. He thought of the towering crystalline spires of his city, the warm twin suns beating down on the bustling plazas. He wondered how long it would take for the Concordant to send a letter of condolence to his family. A standard form letter, no doubt. We regret to inform you that your unit has ceased optimal functionality. Clank. A deep, reverberating shudder ran through the spine of the Celestia. Alfred's eyes fluttered open. He thought it was a hallucination, a final trick of a dying brain. But then he felt it again, a heavy rhythmic vibration shaking the ice from the overhead bulkheads. Clank, clank, clank. Caldwell. Alfred croaked, his throat raw and bleeding from the frozen toxic air. Caldwell, report. The communications officer didn't move. Alfred unbuckled his restraints, his muscles screaming in protest. Every movement felt like wading through wet cement. He dragged himself across the zero-G environment, pulling hand over hand along the railing until he reached her station. He slapped her shoulder plate. Caldwell gasped, her eyes snapping open in a panic. "Captain, the sensors!" Alfred wheezed, pointing a trembling finger at the dead console. "Did we hit an asteroid?" Caldwell weakly tapped a sequence to boot the emergency short-range telemetry. A small circular screen flickered to life, bathing her face in a pale blue light. She stared at it for a long, uncomprehending moment. "Captain," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Gravimetric sensors are picking up a massive displacement wave. Something is dropping out of warp, right on top of us." Alfred pulled himself up to look at the screen. The reading was impossible. The displacement wave was massive, carrying an energy signature that defied all concordant regulations. It wasn't the sleek, refined dark matter engines of a concordant cruiser. This signature was loud, aggressive, and burning with the raw, terrifying power of a highly advanced fusion drive. "Is it a pirate galleon?" Alfred asked, a cold dread replacing the lethargy. If it was the Varric cartel, death by asphyxiation would be a mercy. "No," Caldwell said, her fingers moving faster now, adrenaline fighting back the CO2 poisoning. "The transponder code. Captain, it's not concordant. It's Earth standard." Suddenly, the dead communication console exploded into life. The static was deafening, a harsh hiss of radiation before a voice cut through. It wasn't the polite, synthesized, artificially polite greeting of a concordant official. It was deep, rough, and carried a heavy, undeniable weight. "Concordant Vessel Celestia, this is the United Earth System's dreadnought Aegis. We read your distress beacon. Hold tight, neighbors. We're coming in." Alfred stared at the comms unit. No request for identification. No demand for a bureaucratic hazard code. No mention of jurisdiction or political boundaries. Just a blunt, absolute statement of intent. Through the frost-covered viewport, the black void of space suddenly tore open. It didn't ripple gracefully. It shattered. A blinding flash of Cherenkov radiation washed over the Celestia, illuminating the bridge as a gargantuan shadow eclipsed the distant stars. Alfred dragged himself to the glass, wiping away the ice with the sleeve of his suit. It was a monster. The human ship was an absolute leviathan of war and industry. Unlike the elegant, curved aerodynamic designs of the Concordant, the Aegis was a brutalist masterpiece of function over form. It was a massive, blocky wedge of dark radar-absorbent armor, plating bristling with kinetic railgun batteries, heavy missile pods, and massive heat radiators that glowed a furious, angry red. Along its flank, illuminated by massive floodlights, were old, faded insignias, heritage markers of the ancient Earth megacorps that had pooled their resources centuries ago to build the first human armadas. Alfred could faintly make out the stylized X of SpaceX Interstellar and the sharp geometric eagle of Lockheed Martin Astromining embossed on the thick titanium tungsten hull. It wasn't a rescue ship. It was a warship, a dreadnought capable of cracking a moon in half, and it had crossed into the dead zone just for them. "Aegis," Alfred managed to say into the comms, his voice breaking. "This is Captain Alfred. We have 0 life support. We are immobile. 14 hours of air. Copy that, Celestia," the human voice replied, smooth and unbothered by the crisis. "Forget 14 hours, Alfred. We'll have you breathing Earth-standard air in 14 minutes, deploying umbilical grapples and medical breaching pods now. Do not open your airlocks. We're cutting through." Cutting through? Eris, who had regained semi-consciousness, gasped in horror. "They're going to breach the hull. They'll decompress the ship." Before Alfred could respond, a series of terrifying, deafening thuds echoed through the Celestia. The human dreadnought wasn't delicately maneuvering. It had literally launched heavily armored magnetic boarding torpedoes directly at their hull. "They are insane," Eris whispered. "They are here," Alfred corrected, a strange, overwhelming sense of relief washing over him. For the first time in 3 days, he wasn't afraid. The breaching process was violently efficient. The human pods locked onto the Celestia's primary portside airlock with a magnetic force that violently jerked the smaller frigate. A high-pitched whine of plasma cutters instantly followed, slicing through the reinforced titanium doors in a matter of seconds. With a pressurized hiss, the heavy doors were kicked inward, ringing loudly against the deck. Through the breach came the humans. They didn't move like the delicate, methodical medics of the Concordant. They moved like soldiers. They were clad in heavy, bulky EV extravehicular environmental suits, colored in stark whites and dark grays with heavily tinted visors. Each suit bore a heavily modified medical kit, and to Alfred's shock, high-powered kinetic sidearms holstered at their thighs. "Move, move, move!" a voice barked through external speakers. "Establish a pressure tent. Hook up the atmospheric scrubbers. I want heat in this tin can now." 4 humans rushed into the room, instantly deploying a rapidly expanding polyurethane tent that sealed the breached section. Within seconds, a massive portable atmospheric generator was slammed onto the floor. It roared to life, violently pumping thick, warm, oxygen-rich air into the frozen bridge. The temperature spiked almost immediately. The frost on the bulkheads began to melt, dripping down onto the floor plates. One of the humans, sporting a commander's insignia on his shoulder, marched directly up to Alfred. The human reached up, unlocking his helmet with a sharp hiss of releasing pressure, and pulled it off. He was an older human with deeply tanned skin, a thick silver-streaked beard, and eyes that held the fierce, unyielding intensity of a predator, softened only by a distinct look of deep concern. "Captain Alfred," the human asked, offering a thick, heavily gloved hand. Alfred took it, surprised by the crushing solid grip. "I am, and you are Captain Jonathan Hayes, United Earth Space Force," the man said, looking around the bridge. He signaled to his medics, who were already rushing to Caldwell, and Eris, injecting them with potent, fast-acting, oxygen-saturating compounds. "You boys took a hell of a beating. When we picked up your legacy SOS, we thought it was a ghost signal. Nobody uses those frequencies anymore." It was a desperate measure, Captain Hayes. Alfred said, his lungs burning as they eagerly devoured the warm air. "The Concordant, they would not have come. We are outside their designated safety grid. The risk was deemed too high." Hayes's expression darkened, a flash of pure human contempt crossing his features. "Calculated risk. Right. Well, humanity has a different policy. You broadcast an SOS, we answer. We don't leave people to die in the dark. It's bad for the soul." Eris, sitting up as a human medic, wrapped a thick thermal blanket around his shoulders, looked at Hayes in bewilderment. "But you are a dreadnought, a military vessel, sending a warship of this magnitude into the dead zone just to save 40 alien scientists. The fuel expenditure alone. The tactical vulnerability." Hayes let out a low, rumbling laugh. "Son, my ship is powered by a dark fusion core built off the schematics of the original Boeing star drives. We have enough juice to burn a hole through time itself. As for tactical vulnerability..." Hayes patted the heavy sidearm at his hip. Let's just say I'd pity the fool who tries to take advantage of us doing a good deed. As if the universe was listening, a sharp, piercing alarm began to scream from the tactical wrist pad of Hayes's suit. At the same time, the human comms officer, standing near the breach, tapped his earpiece. Captain Hayes, we have multiple slip space ruptures detected on the edge of the sector. 4. No 6 hostile signatures. They are burning hot and fast right toward our position. Alfred's blood ran cold. The Varak cartel. The pirates who patrolled the edges of the dead zone must have finally picked up the distress signal or tracked the massive energy spike of the Aegis dropping out of warp. They tracked our distress beacon, Alfred said, panic rising in his chest. Captain Hayes, you have to disconnect and flee. The Varak cartel operates with heavily modified cruiser-class ships. They use illegal plasma torpedoes that bypass standard shielding. If you stay attached to us, you are a sitting target. Hayes didn't flinch. He didn't order a retreat. He didn't look at his tactical officer and run a risk assessment algorithm. He simply looked at the tactical feed on his wrist, his jaw setting into a hard, immovable line. 6 ships, Hayes muttered almost to himself. He looked back up at Alfred and gave a terrifying wolfish grin. Alfred, tell me something. Have you ever seen a human warship fire its main battery? No, Alfred stammered. Hayes keyed his communicator. Aegis Actual to Combat Information Center. Spool up the main heavy mass drivers. Divert all secondary power from the rear deflectors to the frontal overlapping shields. Lock targeting telemetry onto the incoming hostile signatures. Aegis CIC copy. Guns are hot, Captain. We have tone, awaiting your command. Captain, Eris yelled. You cannot fight 6 cruisers while tethered to a dead ship. The recoil alone will shatter our hull. Don't worry about your hull engineer, Hayes said, calmly pulling his helmet back over his head. His voice shifted back to the metallic amplified external speakers. We're not going to disconnect. We're going to tow you. Aegis initiate localized grav plating sync. Hold them steady. Outside, the massive human dreadnought groaned as its colossal thrusters shifted. It didn't retreat. Instead, the Aegis swung its massive wedge-shaped prow forward, physically placing its billions of tons of armor between the crippled Celestia and the incoming pirate fleet. It was the ultimate defiant gesture, a shield made of iron and spite. Let them come, Hayes said, his voice echoing in the confined space of the bridge as the proximity alarms howled. Let's show these bastards what happens when you interrupt a human rescue mission. The 6 Varak cartel cruisers ripped out of slipspace like jagged daggers slicing through a black canvas. Unlike the Aegis, which was a blunt instrument of brutalist geometry, the pirate vessels were predatory. They were constructed from scavenged concordant alloys, stripped of anything that did not directly contribute to speed or lethality. Their hulls were painted in chaotic, disruptive patterns of crimson and black, and their engine trails burned with a toxic, unstable violet hue. They flew in a tight, aggressive hunting formation, clearly expecting to find a crippled, helpless survey frigate ready to be picked clean. Instead, they found a wall of earth-forged iron. Aboard the frozen bridge of the Celestia, Captain Alfred watched through the viewport as the massive human dreadnought physically eclipsed the approaching fleet. The Aegis did not broadcast a warning. It did not power up navigational lights to make itself known. It simply sat there in the dark, a dormant leviathan waiting. Incoming transmission, Lieutenant Caldwell shouted over the roar of the human atmospheric generators, pumping air into their bridge. Audio only. It's an open channel from the lead Varak cruiser. Captain Hayes, standing resolute in the center of the alien bridge with his helmet tucked under his arm, nodded. "Put it on speaker, Lieutenant. Let's hear what the vultures have to say." A sharp burst of static hissed through the room, followed by a series of guttural clicks and a harsh synthesized translation. "Unknown vessel, you have trespassed into a Varric cartel claiming zone. Disconnect from the salvage. Power down your drives and prepare for boarding, or you will be reduced to ash. You have 30 seconds. Alfred's feathers bristled. The Varric were notorious for their cruelty. They rarely left survivors, preferring to sell captive crews to the subterranean mining colonies of the Outer Rim. Hayes didn't even blink. He reached down to his wrist pad, opening a direct line to his own ship's combat information center. "Aegis CIC, route my voice through the main comms array. Push it through their firewalls. I want them to hear this loud and clear." A green light blinked on Hayes's wrist. He cleared his throat. "Varric Fleet. This is Captain Jonathan Hayes of the United Earth Space Force Dreadnought Aegis. I am currently conducting a medical and rescue operation under the authority of the human race. You are interfering with my work." Hayes's voice was dangerously calm, devoid of any panic or posturing. "I am going to give you one chance to turn your ships around and jump back to whatever rock you crawled out from under. If you lock targeting sensors onto my ship, I will wipe you from the cosmos." There was a brief pause on the radio. Then a harsh grating sound filled the bridge, the sound of Varric laughter. "Human," the pirate commander mocked. "You are a single lumbering transport. We are 6 hunter-killers armed with plasma torpedoes. You cannot." "Aegis CIC." Hayes interrupted, his voice snapping like a whip. "Cut their feed. Let's show them what a transport can do. Activate the Northrop Grumman deflector grid." Outside space itself seemed to distort around the Aegis. A shimmering hexagonal matrix of pure, hardened electromagnetic energy flared into existence, wrapping the dreadnought in an impenetrable shell of localized gravity. The Varric commander, realizing negotiations were over, ordered his fleet to fire. Dozens of glowing superheated plasma torpedoes erupted from the pirate cruisers, streaking across the void like angry hornets. They slammed into the Aegis's shields in a blinding storm of explosive fury. The silent vacuum of space lit up with brilliant flashes of azure and crimson. Alfred braced himself, expecting the Celestia to be torn apart by the residual shockwaves. But the Aegis didn't even flinch. The Northrop Grumman deflector tech absorbed the staggering kinetic and thermal energy, dissipating it harmlessly along the armor plating. "Shields holding at 98%, a voice crackled from Hayes's earpiece. "Paint barely got scratched, Captain." Hayes smiled, a cold, terrifying expression. "Return fire. Raytheon batteries full spread. Main magnetic accelerator cannons on the lead ship. Fire." Along the dorsal spine of the human dreadnought, heavy armored panels slid back to reveal colossal twin-linked railguns. There was no flash, no fiery explosion, just a momentary blur of displaced light as the Aegis fired a series of 2-ton tungsten slugs at a fraction of the speed of light. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The lead Varric cruiser, the ship that had just demanded their surrender, ceased to exist. The sheer kinetic force of the human weapon bypassed the pirates' primitive shields entirely, punching completely through their reinforced hull and igniting their reactor. The ship detonated in a brilliant expanding sphere of white-hot plasma, taking a second cruiser caught in the blast radius with it. In less than 3 seconds, humanity had turned a third of the pirate fleet into expanding clouds of cosmic dust. "Good hits," Hayes said, casually, checking his tactical feed. "Target the next Captain Caldwell screamed, her hands flying over her console. The remaining pirate ships, they aren't firing back. They are deploying something. Energy spike detected. It's massive. From the burning wreckage of the pirate formation, the 4 remaining ships broke off in different directions, dumping massive cylindrical canisters into space before engaging their slipspace drives and fleeing in terror. The canisters didn't explode. Instead, they spun rapidly, projecting agonizingly bright beams of violet light that intersected perfectly in the space between the Aegis and the Celestia. "What the hell is that?" Hayes demanded. Before anyone could answer, a bone-rattling groan tore through the Celestia. The artificial gravity violently shifted, throwing Alfred Aris and the human medics to the deck. "It's a gravimetric snare," Aris yelled, clawing his way back to his engineering console. "It's a localized singularity tether. They didn't hit us with weapons, they anchored us." The bridge of the Celestia was pure chaos. The groaning of the hull grew louder, transforming into the terrifying shriek of metal being stressed beyond its absolute limits. The violet light from the pirate canisters pulsed like a heartbeat, creating a swirling vortex of gravitational distortion that gripped both ships like an invisible vice. "Aegis to Captain Hayes." The radio cracked the voice of the human helmsman, thick with panic. "Sir, we are caught in a localized gravity well. It's acting like an anchor. Our main drives are spiking, but we aren't moving. If we try to jump to slipspace while tethered to this anomaly, the sheer force will rip the dreadnought in half." Alfred pulled himself up, using the edge of the command table. He looked at the sensor readouts, his blood turning to ice. "Captain Hayes," he gasped. "The anomaly that disabled my ship 3 days ago. It wasn't a natural occurrence. It was a trap. The Varric set these snares in the dead zone to cripple passing ships, then wait for them to die. They just dropped a fresh one right on top of us." "Can we shoot it?" Hayes asked, his eyes darting across the readouts on his wrist. "No!" Aris yelled, his avian crest flared in absolute terror. "It's a singularity matrix. Kinetic weapons will just be absorbed, adding mass to the gravity well. Energy weapons will cause a localized supernova effect. It's feeding on our proximity." The Celestia shuddered violently. A loud, echoing crack reverberated from the lower decks. Captain Caldwell reported, her voice trembling. "Deck 4 is buckling. The structural integrity of the Celestia is dropping rapidly. The gravity well is pulling the Aegis and our ship in opposite directions. The tethering clamps. They're tearing our hull apart." It was the ultimate trap. The human dreadnought was too heavily armored to be easily crushed by the snare, but the fragile Concordant survey ship was caught in the middle of a cosmic tug-of-war. The Aegis was trying to hold its position while the snare tried to drag it down. The Celestia was the rope. Alfred looked at Hayes. The human captain's face was grim. The calculus of the situation was painfully simple, the very kind of math the Galactic Concordant relied upon. "Captain Hayes," Alfred said, his voice surprisingly steady, "you have to detach the umbilicals, retract your boarding tubes, and disengage the magnetic grapples." Hayes looked at him, his brow furrowing. "If I do that, the snare will pull your ship directly into the singularity. You'll be crushed into a space the size of a marble in less than a minute." "I know," Alfred said. He looked back at his shivering crew, the men and women he had led into this nightmare. Then he looked at the human. "Your ship has the thruster power to break the event horizon if you don't have our dead weight dragging you down. You came for us. You fought for us. That is more than my own government would have done. But I will not let 42 of my people be the reason thousands of humans die today." Disconnect Jonathan. That is an order from one captain to another. Hayes stared at the alien commander. For a long second, the only sound was the screaming metal of the dying frigate and the heavy breathing of the human medics. Then Hayes reached for his comms unit. "Aegis CIC, this is Hayes." Alfred closed his eyes, preparing for the end. It was the logical choice. It was the only choice. "Route me to Chief Engineer Mitchell," Hayes commanded. Alfred's eyes snapped open. "What are you doing?" "Mitchell here, boss," a heavily accented gruff voice replied over the comms. The background noise on the human end sounded like a heavy industrial manufacturing plant. "Mitchell, we are caught in a Varric singularity snare," Hayes said rapidly. "It's stressing the Celestia's hull to the breaking point. Captain Alfred here thinks I should cut them loose and save our own skin." "Well, with all due respect to Captain Alfred, that sounds like quitter talk," Mitchell replied, a distinct sound of a heavy wrench hitting a steel deck echoing through the line. "We didn't fly 3 days through the dark just to leave them to get compacted into space dust." "My thoughts exactly," Hayes grinned. "How do we break a localized gravity well without shooting it?" There was a pause filled with the sound of rapid typing. "A gravity snare runs on a stabilized feedback loop. If we can introduce a massive, completely unstabilized energy spike into the center of the anomaly, it will overload the matrix and shatter the snare. Like popping a balloon by blowing too much air into it." "Where do we get an unstabilized energy spike big enough to break a black hole?" Hayes asked. Eris's eyes went wide. The avian engineer looked between Hayes and the radio. No, you cannot be thinking what I think you are thinking." "Engineer Eris," Hayes prompted, raising an eyebrow. "The Celestia's primary reactor," Eris stammered in horror. "It's dead, yes, but the dark matter containment core is still physically intact. If we were to flood it with raw, uncalibrated power, we could intentionally induce a catastrophic cascade failure. We could detonate my ship's reactor as a gravimetric bomb." "The Birdman is a genius," Mitchell shouted over the radio. "That's exactly it. If we jumpstart their dead reactor, the feedback loop will blow the snare wide open. But we have no power," Eris countered, his panic rising. "The reactor is dead. That is why we are freezing in the first place." "You don't," Hayes corrected, a wild, reckless fire lighting up his eyes. "But I have a dreadnought powered by a dark fusion core. Mitchell, break out the heavy jumper cables." "This is madness," Eris yelled, tethered to the external hull of the Celestia, alongside Chief Engineer Mitchell. They were floating in the cold void of space, surrounded by the swirling, terrifying violet light of the gravity snare. Below them, the colossal bulk of the Aegis hovered like a steel mountain, while the Celestia groaned and buckled under their magnetic boots. "Madness is just engineering that hasn't been peer-reviewed yet, Feathers," Mitchell shouted back over the localized comms. The human was encased in a heavily reinforced burnt orange EV suit. Strapped to his back was a massive bundle of thick, heavily insulated conduits, industrial power cables, thick as tree trunks. Mitchell hauled the cables forward, fighting against the erratic gravitational pulls. "The Aegis is routing power from our secondary fusion drives directly into these lines. We are using Tesla industrial supercapacitors to step up the voltage. We need to manually plug these directly into your ship's main reactor intake." The intake was fused shut during the initial overload 3 days ago. Eris argued, his delicate hands struggling with the heavy plasma cutter Mitchell had shoved into his grip. "Then we cut it open," Mitchell roared. "Get slicing, Eris. We are out of time." Back on the bridge, Alfred and Hayes watched the telemetry screens with bated breath. The structural integrity of the Celestia had dropped to a critical 14%. Bulkheads were collapsing on the lower decks. "Captain Hayes." Lieutenant Caldwell's voice was a terrified whisper. "Long-range sensors. The Varric ships didn't just flee. They went to fetch the master." A new alert screamed from the Aegis tactical feed. A massive, terrifyingly large slipspace rupture was forming at the edge of the sector. The energy signature dwarfed the previous cruisers. It was a Varric mothership, a mobile fortress heavily armed and heavily shielded, coming to collect the prey caught in its snare. "Mitchell," Hayes barked into the radio. "We have company arriving in exactly 2 minutes. If you don't blow that snare now, we're going to have a dreadnought-sized hole punch through us." "Almost there, boss," Mitchell grunted. Outside on the hull, Eris finished slicing through the heavy titanium plating of the reactor access port. The metal panel kicked away into the void, revealing the dark, dormant core of the Celestia's dark matter drive. "Clear," Eris yelled. Mitchell hauled the heavy Tesla cables forward, slamming the massive locking pins directly into the raw, exposed nodes of the alien reactor. Sparks showered violently into the vacuum, bouncing off their visors. Mitchell slammed a heavy fist against a manual locking mechanism sealing the connection. "Cables are hot. Connection is solid," Mitchell yelled, grabbing Eris by the harness and activating his suit's maneuvering thrusters, violently propelling them both away from the exposed reactor and back toward the safety of the umbilical airlock. Aegis CIC hit the juice. Inside the human dreadnought engineers, through massive physical breaker switches, the Aegis roared. Raw, unbridled fusion energy surged from the human warship, traveling up the massive tethers and slamming directly into the dead core of the Celestia. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the alien ship began to vibrate. A blinding pure white light erupted from the Celestia's engineering bay. The dark matter core, overwhelmed by the brute force injection of human power, instantly destabilized. "Cascade failure imminent," Caldwell screamed, shielding her eyes from the monitors. "Aegis cut the feed, retract the cables, and route all power to the main slipspace drive," Hayes ordered, bracing himself against the command table. He looked at Alfred. "Hold on to something." The Celestia's reactor didn't explode in a burst of fire. It inverted. A massive shockwave of concentrated anti-gravity erupted outward. The silent, invisible wave slammed into the violet singularity of the snare. The two opposing forces met in a catastrophic collision of physics. Space itself seemed to shatter like glass. The violet light of the snare flickered, shrieked, and violently detonated, canceling out the gravity well in a blinding flash of raw energy. The crushing pressure vanished instantly. "Snare is broken," the Aegis helmsman shouted. "We are free! Jump!" Hayes roared. "Get us the hell out of here!" Just as the massive, jagged prow of the Varric mothership tore its way out of slipspace cannons, already glowing with lethal intent, the Aegis engaged its Boeing-derived hyperdrives. The human dreadnought, still firmly clutching the battered, broken shell of the Celestia to its side like a protective parent, accelerated to faster-than-light speeds in a fraction of a millisecond. They left nothing behind but a chaotic storm of radiation and a very angry, empty-handed pirate armada. On the bridge, the artificial gravity normalized. The warm air continued to flow from the human generators. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady rhythmic thrum of the Aegis's engines, pushing them safely through the slipstream far away from the dead zone. Alfred slowly pulled himself up from the floor. He looked at Caldwell, who was laughing in pure, unadulterated relief. He looked at the human medics, who were already rushing back to check the vitals of the recovering crew. Finally, he looked at Captain Hayes. The human commander had taken his helmet off again, wiping a thin sheen of sweat from his forehead. He looked over at Alfred and offered a tired but genuine smile. "Well," Hayes breathed, clapping the alien captain on the shoulder. "That was entirely too close. How about we get you boys back to concordant space? I think you owe my engineer a drink." Alfred looked at the massive, heavy hand resting on his shoulder. A gesture of familiarity, of pack bonding from a species the rest of the galaxy considered chaotic monsters. Alfred smiled back, a deep, profound sense of gratitude washing over him. "Captain Hayes," Alfred said softly, "I think the Concordant owes your entire species a drink." The slipstream was a swirling tunnel of chronoton radiation and bent starlight, a beautiful, terrifying highway through the fabric of the universe. Inside that tunnel, the United Earth System's dreadnought Aegis thundered forward, its massive Boeing-engineered hyperdrives pushing the ship to its absolute limits. Clamped firmly to its port flank was the battered, scorched, and utterly silent shell of the Concordant survey frigate Celestia. Aboard the Aegis, the medical bay was a hive of controlled, efficient chaos. The humans had not just rescued the 42 alien scientists. They had treated them as if they were their own blood. Captain Alfred sat on a reinforced surgical bio bed, wincing as a human medical officer. Dr. William Bradley applied a thick, translucent paste to a severe frostbite burn on Alfred's avian arm. "Try not to move, Captain," Dr. Bradley said, his voice muffled slightly by a sterile surgical mask. "That's a synthesized Johnson & Johnson dermal regenerator gel. It's packed with microstims. It'll feel like a swarm of angry ants for about 3 minutes, but it will rebuild the necrotic tissue right down to the cellular level." Alfred hissed as the gel began to bubble, a sharp prickling heat flooding his arm. "Your medical technology is surprisingly aggressive, Doctor," Bradley chuckled, reaching for a metallic syringe bearing a faded Pfizer logo. "You should see our immune systems. We humans evolved on a death world. Everything on Earth either wanted to eat us, poison us, or freeze us. We had to get aggressive just to survive to the next sunrise." Alfred looked around the sprawling medical bay. His crew, the surviving members of the Celestia, were wrapped in thick, heated mylar blankets, sipping high-calorie nutrient broths from specialized thermoses. Human nurses and medics moved between them, offering words of encouragement, adjusting IV drips and sharing quiet jokes. Aris, the chief engineer, was sitting up in a nearby bed, arguing animatedly with Chief Engineer Mitchell. The two had bonded over the sheer, terrifying insanity of their improvised reactor bomb. "I am telling you, Mitchell," Aris squawked, gesturing wildly with his good hand. "If the output of the Tesla capacitors had been even 0.5% higher, you wouldn't have shattered the singularity snare, you would have inverted the localized gravity field and collapsed both our ships into a micro-quasar, actintians antintentictis." Mitchell, a massive mountain of a man with grease stained into the deep lines of his face, just laughed, leaning against the doorframe. "Yeah, but it wasn't, was it? We humans have a saying, Ares. If it looks stupid, but it works, it ain't stupid." Besides, the structural integrity of those Tesla coils is rated for exactly that kind of abuse. They were originally designed for deep core asteroid mining. You can drop a mountain on them and they'll still hold a charge. Alfred watched the exchange, a profound sense of awe washing over him. The Galactic Concordant operated on strict mathematical algorithms of survival. If a situation had less than a 60% probability of success, action was aborted. Yet these humans operated on something entirely different. They operated on defiance, on spite, on an innate, terrifying pack-bonding instinct that compelled them to dive headfirst into the abyss just to pull a stranger out. The door to the medical bay hissed open, and Captain Jonathan Hayes stepped in. He had traded his heavy armored EV suit for a crisp, dark navy uniform. He looked exhausted, the deep bags under his eyes, betraying the toll the last few hours had taken on him. "How are our guests doing, Doc?" Hayes asked, walking up to Alfred's bed. "Vitals are stabilizing across the board, Captain," Dr. Bradley reported. "Mild radiation exposure from the dark matter cascade, but nothing our scrubbers can't handle. They'll live." "Glad to hear it," Hayes said. He looked at Alfred, his expression turning serious. "Captain Alfred, my tactical officer Jenkins just finished analyzing the telemetry from our jump. We have a problem." Alfred's feathers tightened against his skin. "The Varric mothership," Hayes nodded grimly. "When we blew the singularity snare, the resulting chronoton surge left a massive isotopic footprint, a breadcrumb trail in the slipstream. They are tracking our wake." "Can they catch us?" Eris interrupted, suddenly looking very pale. "Normally no," Hayes said, crossing his arms. "The Aegis is one of the fastest dreadnoughts in the United Earth Fleet, but we are towing 30,000 tons of dead weight. The drag on our hyperfield is massive. They are gaining on us. Then you must cut us loose," Alfred said instantly, repeating his order from the dead zone. "Captain Hayes, you have already saved our crew. We are aboard your vessel. Eject the Celestia. Let the Varric have the empty hull. Without the drag, you can easily outrun them." Hayes shook his head slowly. "I can't do that, Alfred." "Why not?" Alfred pleaded. "It is just a ship. The crew is safe." "Because," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "if I drop your ship, the Varric will board it. They will rip out your navigational computers. They will download the concordant patrol routes, your planetary defense grids, and the security protocols for a dozen civilian colonies. The Varric don't want the metal, Alfred. They want the data. If I drop your ship, millions of your people could die in pirate raids over the next decade." Alfred went perfectly still. He hadn't thought of that. The concordant protocols mandated a self-destruct of the main databanks in the event of capture, but the Celestia's power grid had died before the purge could be initiated. "So," Hayes said, a hard, unyielding glint in his eye, "we are keeping the ship. We are dropping out of slipspace in exactly 40 minutes at the edge of the concordant border sector, Sigma 9. I've already sent a tight beam transmission to the concordant border patrol station there. We'll hand you and your ship over to your people, and then we will deal with the Varric." "Captain Hayes," Alfred whispered, "a Varric mothership is a flying fortress. It is armed with weapons that can glass a continent. Even your dreadnought cannot stand against it alone." Hayes offered a grim, terrifying smile. "Who said anything about standing alone? We're heading for a concordant military border station. Surely your people will help us defend it." Alfred looked away, a deep, shameful knot forming in his stomach. He knew the concordant. He knew their mathematics. "I wouldn't count on it, Jonathan," Alfred said softly. "I really wouldn't." Space tore open with a violent, shuddering crack as the Aegis forcefully decoupled its hyperdrives. The massive human dreadnought, still clutching the lifeless Celestia, drifted into the cold, starlit expanse of Sector Sigma 9. Looming before them was Outpost Charlie, a massive ring-shaped space station belonging to the Galactic Concordant Border Defense Force. It was pristine, elegant, and glowing with the soft blue light of 1,000 orderly windows. Surrounding the station were 4 sleek aerodynamic concordant cruisers, their weapons powered down, holding a defensive passive perimeter. On the bridge of the Aegis, Captain Hayes stood over the central holographic tactical table, Alfred standing beside him. The human bridge was a masterclass in pragmatic design, exposed conduits, heavy tactile keyboards, and screens displaying rivers of raw, unfiltered data. "Comms," Hayes barked. "Get me the commander of that station." "Channel open, Captain," Jenkins, the tactical officer, replied. A shimmering hologram flickered into existence above the table. It depicted a tall, sharply dressed concordant official of the reptilian Saurian race. His face was a mask of cold, unreadable logic. "This is Commander Varek of Outpost Charlie." The official stated, his voice clipped and precise. "United Earth vessel, we received your tight beam. You are towing a crippled concordant survey ship. We have prepared a docking bay for you to deposit the salvage and the survivors. You are then ordered to vacate concordant space immediately." Hayes narrowed his eyes. "Commander Varek, we don't have time for a polite drop-off. We are being hunted. A Varek cartel mothership tracked our slipspace wake. They are roughly 10 minutes behind us. I need your 4 cruisers to form up on my flanks. We need to establish an overlapping fire corridor to greet them when they drop out of warp." Varek blinked his reptilian eyes slowly. "Negative, Captain Hayes. Our long-range scanners have already detected the incoming mass shadow. The Varek mothership possesses a threat level index of Omega-4. The combined firepower of your vessel and my 4 cruisers has only a 22.4% chance of achieving absolute victory without catastrophic losses. Under Concordant Mandate 419, we are not authorized to engage in a mathematically doomed conflict." Alfred felt his heart sink. It was exactly as he had feared. "Mathematically doomed," Hayes growled, leaning over the table, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge. "Listen to me, you bureaucratic lizard. That pirate ship has been hunting in your territory for years. If you don't stand with us here, and now they will slaughter everyone on this station, and then they will take the Celestia's data core. The mathematical probability of the Varek assaulting a fortified concordant station is less than 8%, Varek countered smoothly. "They are pirates, Captain. They are here for you and the salvage you stole from their snare. If you disconnect from the Celestia and leave our space, they will take the prize and depart. The Concordant is willing to accept the loss of the data core to avoid a military conflict with the cartel. They'll use that data to kill millions of your own citizens." Hayes roared, his voice shaking the bridge. "Future probabilities are not current liabilities," Varek said coldly. "Disconnect the ship, Captain Hayes, or we will be forced to view your presence as a hostile act." The hologram fizzled out. The silence on the human bridge was absolute. Every human officer, from the helmsman to the tactical chief, turned to look at Captain Hayes. They were angry. Alfred could feel the heat of their fury radiating in the air. "Captain," Jenkins said quietly, "slipspace rupture detected, 10,000 kilometers off our port bow. They are here." Outside the viewport, the stars seemed to bleed. A massive jagged tear in reality ripped open, and the Varek mothership emerged. It was a nightmare of engineering. It was 3 times the size of the Aegis, built from the scavenged hulls of 100 dead ships, bristling with illegal plasma batteries, heavy ion cannons, and a massive central spinal mount weapon that glowed with a sickly irradiated green light. "They're charging main batteries," Jenkins reported, her hands flying over her console. Targeting lock established on us. The concordant cruisers are falling back. They are abandoning the perimeter. Alfred looked at the retreating concordant ships. His own people. The people he had sworn to serve. They were running away, leaving the humans to die. "Jonathan," Alfred said, his voice breaking, "you have to run. Dump the Celestia. Save your crew. You owe us nothing." Captain Jonathan Hayes stared out the viewport at the massive pirate dreadnought. He didn't look at the retreating concordant ships. He didn't look at the math. He reached down and keyed his ship-wide intercom. "All hands, this is the captain," Hayes said, his voice calm, steady, and carrying the terrible, undeniable weight of human resolve. "The Concordant has declined to assist. The Varric mothership is on our doorstep. They want the people we saved. They want the ship we towed." Hayes paused, letting his words hang in the air. "I don't know about you," Hayes continued, a wicked, defiant smile spreading across his face, "but I didn't drag this rusted piece of concordant junk across a third of the sector just to hand it over to a bunch of space scavengers. Spin up the General Dynamics combat drives. Divert all life support power from decks 5 through 10 to the forward deflector screens. Load the heavy armor-piercing tungsten rounds into the main batteries." "Captain," Jenkins asked, a wild grin matching his own. "Orders." "We are going to teach these pirates a lesson in orbital ballistics," Hayes said. "Helmsman, full ahead, ramming speed, take us right down their throat." The Aegis did not fire immediately. Instead, the human dreadnought engaged its massive thrusters, burning raw fusion energy as it accelerated on a direct suicidal collision course with the Varric mothership. Aboard outpost, Charlie Commander Varric watched his tactical screens in absolute shock. The human ship was ignoring every known doctrine of space combat. They weren't evasive maneuvering. They weren't deploying countermeasures. They were charging straight into the teeth of an Omega-4 threat. "They are insane," Varric whispered to himself. The Varric mothership opened fire. Dozens of superheated plasma torpedoes and ion beams lashed out, slamming into the Aegis's forward deflector shields. The void lit up in a blinding storm of energy. The human ship shuddered violently, but the Northrop Grumman shields held glowing a furious, blinding white as they absorbed terajoules of raw, destructive power. "Shields down to 40%, Jenkins shouted over the deafening roar of the impacts vibrating through the hull. 30%, they are tearing us apart. Captain, hold your fire." Hayes commanded, his eyes locked on the rapidly expanding image of the pirate fortress in the viewport. "Wait until we see the whites of their eyes. Captain, they are charging the central spinal weapon," Alfred yelled, pointing at the massive glowing green barrel on the Varric ship. "If that hits us, shields won't matter. It will core us like an apple. 20 seconds to their firing solution," Jenkins counted down. "Shields at 15%. "Helmsman O'Connor," Hayes said calmly, "prepare to initiate the BAE Systems inertial dampening purge on my mark." "Aye, Captain. Dampeners standing by." 10 seconds, Jenkins yelled. "Shields at 5%. They are collapsing." The Varric mothership loomed massive in the viewport, completely filling the screen. The glowing green maw of their central weapon was blinding. "Mark!" Hayes roared. Helmsman O'Connor slammed his fist onto a massive red override switch. Instantly, the Aegis cut its main forward thrusters and vented its entire, localized inertial dampening field directly out of its ventral ports. In the vacuum of space, this violent explosive decompression acted as a massive instantaneous thruster. The human dreadnought violently shoved itself upward on the y-axis, moving with a speed that defied its massive bulk. A fraction of a second later, the Varric mothership fired its spinal weapon. The massive beam of irradiated green plasma tore through the space where the Aegis had been just a moment before missing their ventral hull by mere meters and sailing harmlessly off into the deep dark. The Aegis was now positioned directly above the pirate fortress, right over its thinly armored dorsal superstructure. "Jenkins!" Hayes screamed. "Give them hell! Firing all batteries!" Jenkins yelled, slamming her hands down on the firing console. The Aegis erupted. Every single weapon on the human dreadnought the main railguns, the secondary mass drivers, the Lockheed Martin, close-in weapon systems, and the heavy missile pods fired simultaneously at point-blank range. It was a devastating point-blank execution. The tungsten slugs from the railguns bypassed the pirates' heavy forward shields, entirely punching straight down through the dorsal armor, shattering bulkheads, and tearing deep into the ship's vital infrastructure. The heavy missiles followed right behind, diving into the gaping wounds created by the railguns and detonating deep within the bowels of the mothership. The Varric fortress didn't stand a chance. A cascading series of massive fiery explosions ripped through the length of the pirate ship. Secondary magazines cooked off, tearing entire sections of the hull away in violent, silent fireballs. Finally, the main reactor core, struck by a hypervelocity tungsten slug, lost containment. The Varric mothership blew apart. It was a spectacular silent supernova of twisted metal and raw plasma. The shockwave slammed into the Aegis, rattling the dreadnought fiercely, but the human ship held steady, floating majestically above the expanding debris field like an apex predator that had just claimed its territory. On the bridge of the Aegis, the silence slowly returned, broken only by the hum of the cooling weapon systems. Alfred stood frozen, staring at the viewport. He had just witnessed the impossible. A single ship, severely disadvantaged, had just annihilated a cartel mothership through sheer audacity and brilliant reckless maneuvering. "Status," Hayes breathed, leaning heavily against the command table. "Shields are down," Jenkins reported, a massive adrenaline-fueled smile on her face. "Armor took a beating on the approach, but we are whole, Captain, and the Varric are... well, they are dust." Hayes nodded, a deep sigh escaping his lips. He looked over at the communications console. "Get me Commander Varric on the horn." A moment later, the hologram of the concordant official reappeared. Varric looked stunned. His scales were pale, and his jaw was slightly slack. "Commander Varric," Hayes said, casually wiping a speck of dust from his uniform. "The hostile threat has been neutralized. The airspace is clear. I'd appreciate it if your tugs could come out here and take this survey frigate off my hands now."